term, originally used to describe a Roman administrative region, later came to define the vast land stretching between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Today, it is widely known as the eastern arm of the Fertile Crescent, a region associated with the birth of early civilization. Yet this landscape was never naturally generous. Its core territories were shaped through constant human effort against difficult environmental conditions. The geography of the region shaped nearly every aspect of life, from agriculture and settlement patterns to political organization and cultural development. Climate, terrain, and access to water determined where people could live, how they farmed, and how cities emerged. Sharp contrasts in temperature and landscape divided the land into clearly defined zones, far more distinct than those found in most temperate regions. Each zone encouraged different ways of life, often producing social, ethnic, and political divisions that influenced historical developments. Mesopotamia. The physical structure of the land directly shaped patterns of communication and power. Mountain ranges limited contact between communities, wide plains allowed movement and exchange, and rivers created natural corridors that guided trade and migration. As a result, large political states emerged primarily in areas where communication was easier. The southern and northern Mesopotamian plains gave rise to powerful civilizations such as Sumer, Babylon, and Assyria, while the surrounding highlands supported other major cultures, including Elam, the Hittite Empire, and Urartu. Between these regions, the mountain belts of the Taurus and Zagros created fragmented landscapes that encouraged local independence and prevented the formation of unified political systems. Cultural influence and social innovation developed mainly in the open plains, rather than in the isolated highlands. For many observers throughout history, the attraction of Mesopotamia lay in its fertile river valleys and the legendary cities that once flourished there. Approaching the region from the Mediterranean, travelers passed through northern Syria toward the Euphrates River, which flows south after descending from the mountains of Anatolia. Along its upper course stood important ancient centers such as Zugma, Carchemish, and Imar, and even earlier settlements dating to prehistoric times. As the river continues southward, fertile agricultural lands gradually give way to a dry and expansive plain. Although occasional villages and small towns appear along its banks, supported by rich soils deposited by seasonal flooding. The long stretch of river contains relatively few major historical centers. Among these were the ancient city of Terqa, already significant in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, and further downstream the influential city of Mari. Beyond these lay settlements such as Anna and Hit, where natural bitumen deposits were exploited in antiquity for construction and engineering. Beyond the river valleys stretches a vast desert landscape. On one side lies the Jazira, extending toward the Tigris, and on the other, the Syrian desert. These harsh environments became the traditional homeland of nomadic peoples. The desert formed a natural boundary on the western side of Mesopotamia, with only a few established routes connecting it to the outside world. One important path led from Mari westward to the oasis of Tadmor, known in classical times as Palmyra, and continued toward Damascus. The desert once supported wildlife linked to African ecosystems, including ostriches and wild asses, which were hunted or described by ancient travelers. Although today's nomadic populations are largely Arab, their lifestyle cannot simply be projected into deep antiquity. Long-distance desert travel became possible only after the domestication of the camel around the 1st millennium before the Common Era, making the familiar image of the wandering Bedouin a relatively recent development in historical terms. Despite the strong contrast between settled agricultural communities and desert nomads, these groups were never completely separate. Nomadic tribes often grazed their herds within cultivated lands, worked as shepherds for urban landowners, and maintained seasonal patterns of migration between summer and winter pastures. Their movements followed established routes, and some groups even maintained small permanent settlements where agriculture supplemented pastoral life. Agreements regulating grazing rights were common, though disputes frequently arose, and shifts in climate or political power often altered the boundaries between cultivated land and desert. The interaction between these different ways of life shaped much of Mesopotamian political history, as tensions between settled and nomadic populations repeatedly influenced the rise and fall of states. Further south, the Euphrates enters an immense alluvial plain formed by centuries of river deposits. This region differs sharply from the lands to the north. The southern landscape is remarkably flat, lying only slightly above sea level, even hundreds of kilometers from the coast. Such minimal elevation allows rivers to change course easily, transforming dry ground into marshland or desert within a short time. While irrigation is relatively simple due to the availability of water, drainage proves far more difficult. The most visible features of the region are ancient settlement mounds and dense palm groves rising above the flat terrain. Although local conditions may vary, the overall character of the landscape remains consistent across vast distances. In the far south, the rivers eventually lose much of their flow in extensive marshlands before reaching the waters of the Persian Gulf. Here, communities live on islands formed by dense vegetation, building houses from reeds and navigating the waterways by boat. The environment creates an atmosphere of isolation, with towering reeds, abundant bird life, and water buffalo moving through the wetlands. Observers have often portrayed the marsh dwellers as preserving an ancient way of life, centered on fishing, herding, and the use of reeds for construction. However, this lifestyle may not represent an unbroken survival from prehistoric times. Historical evidence suggests that these communities developed through complex processes, including the migration of pastoral groups and the arrival of new technologies, such as water, buffalo herding, during the early Islamic period. Their relative isolation has fluctuated over time, often depending on the strength or weakness of central political authority. To the east, the marshlands extend along the Tigris, separating Mesopotamia from the neighbouring region of Susiana. Travel between these areas followed specific routes, either through narrow passages near the Gulf or along paths that skirted the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. Rivers such as the Diyala played an important role in shaping communication networks, creating corridors that supported agriculture and enabled the growth of cities. These routes eventually connected Mesopotamia to distant regions through major trade roads, leading across the Iranian plateau towards Central Asia and beyond. The Zagros Mountains formed a significant natural barrier along Mesopotamia's eastern frontier. Their ridges separated the fertile lowlands from greener upland territories, marking both a geographical and political boundary. In ancient tradition, these mountains symbolize the edge of the civilized world, representing the lands of unpredictable and often hostile peoples beyond the plains. The valleys within the mountain system contained fertile basins where agriculture flourished, yet the rugged terrain encouraged political fragmentation. Small communities developed independently, and although raids from the highlands occasionally affected the lowland states, mountain groups rarely established lasting control over the plains. To the north, the landscape changes again. The wide northern plains associated with ancient Assyria appear flat from a distance, but are in fact shaped by low hills, shallow valleys, and seasonal waterways. These features influenced settlement patterns and travel routes, directing movement along certain paths and creating natural centers of habitation. The terrain consists largely of limestone formations, broken by fertile pockets of soil suitable for cultivation. Even minor ridges could significantly shape communication and defense, dividing regions and guiding the growth of towns at strategic crossing points. Across all these environments, desert, marsh, mountain, and plain, the diversity of landscapes shaped the development of Mesopotamian civilization. Each region imposed distinct constraints and opportunities, influencing economic activity, political organization, and cultural identity. The interaction between environment and human adaptation defined the historical trajectory of the region, shaping the emergence of cities, the rise of empires, and the complex relationships between settled and mobile populations. Mesopotamia's history cannot be separated from its geography, for the land itself determined the rhythms of life and the foundations of one of the world's earliest civilizations. Unlike the Deep South, the northern plains do not lend themselves to easy irrigation. The land rises and falls in gentle waves, and that rolling surface makes straight, cross-country canals impractical, unless a state is willing to attempt enormous public works. Across different eras, powerful rulers and modern administrations have occasionally tried such schemes. But most farming in the north has traditionally depended on rainfall rather than engineered water control. The settled zones of the northern plains sit between the great mountain systems to the north and east, and the open, drier lands to the south and west. In practice, the true boundary of stable settlement is not a wall or a river, but the invisible line where dependable rain begins to fail. That line curves like a bow alongside the foothills, running from the Euphrates near the latitude of Aleppo, passing close to the Sinjar region, then bending toward the Tigris above Assur and crossing the Diyala near the Hamrin area. It is not fixed, it shifts from year to year, and it can also appear slightly different, depending on how observers choose to define enough rain for crops to survive. To describe this boundary, geographers often use rainfall contours that connect places receiving similar annual totals. Different maps may draw those contours in slightly different ways, and the numbers can feel precise while reality remains uncertain. In theory, certain hardy grains can grow with modest winter rain, while other crops demand a wetter climate. But farming is not secured by averages alone. A community cannot survive on a calculation that looks acceptable over a long time span if, within that span, too many years bring failure. For permanent settlement, what matters is reliability. A village needs a local climate that provides workable rain most years, not just a lucky season now and then. When that practical requirement is applied, the true edge of farming tends to lie farther toward the mountains than a simple map of annual totals might suggest. As a result, the southern and eastern margins of cultivation in the north were never neat lines, they were ragged fringes, thinning out into semi-desert between the Tigris and Euphrates, and, east of the Tigris, in the broad spaces between the Zab rivers and the Diyala. This difference between the modern landscape and the ancient one becomes striking in the Jazira. South of the Sinjar Range today, substantial towns are rare and long stretches appear empty. Yet the plain is scattered with countless ancient mounds, visible even to a casual visitor as dark rises on the horizon. Many of these mounds mark once thriving settlements, including important sites from the 2nd and 3rd millennia before the Common Era. Some were centres of small independent kingdoms, which implies that the region once supported a population far larger than the one it supports now. Explaining that contrast is not simple, but two broad forces offer possible clues. One rooted in society, and the other in climate. A small change in average rainfall can move the frontier of viable agriculture a long distance across flat land. Because the transition from barely enough to not enough can stretch for many kilometers. Unfortunately, direct evidence for precise rainfall changes within Mesopotamia itself is limited, and data from surrounding regions often lacks the resolution needed to settle the question. Another common idea is that earlier landscapes were more wooded, with scrub and small trees extending across areas that are now largely treeless. It is easy to imagine forest cover softening the environment and helping retain moisture, yet solid proof for widespread woodland on these plains remains difficult to secure. There are, however, hints that water behaved differently in some places. Traces of channels near certain ancient sites suggest that seasonal streams may once have been more dependable, or that local water sources existed that are weaker today. Wadis that now cut the plain and fade into larger drainage systems might, under different conditions, have carried water more consistently. In the past, such flows could have been diverted into modest local channels, or they may have been supported by springs and shallow groundwater that has since diminished. Even small improvements in local water availability would have mattered enormously in this borderline zone, where the difference between settlement and abandonment could hinge on a handful of workable seasons. To understand the southern world, the focus shifts from rainfall to controlled water. The lands historically known as Sumer and Akkad formed a coherent unit not simply because they lay on the southern alluvial plain, but because survival there required a distinct economic strategy. Rain is too unreliable to sustain farming in the south at any consistent scale. Yet the alluvial soils are deep and the terrain is so flat that water can be guided across it with careful planning. When the southern plain supported dense populations and flourishing cities, it did so through disciplined management of rivers, channels, and fields. The workable heartland can be defined as the reach of alluvial soils that can be watered by canals or by lifting water from the rivers. Natural borders frame this zone on every side. To the southwest, rocky rises signal the beginning of desert. To the south, wide marshes spread near the head of the Gulf, where the rivers lose themselves before reaching the sea. To the east, marshlands also separate the southern Tigris from the neighbouring lowlands beyond. Farther northeast, irrigation from tributary systems can create an additional lobe of settled land. And to the north, the alluvial soils thin out, leaving only narrow, fertile strips along riverbeds, so that major inland settlements fade until the northern plains begin again. These borders mattered because they shaped a shared way of life. Even when southern cities fought each other and power shifted repeatedly, the basic demands of living on the alluvium created common habits and common needs. That unity, however, did not mean the landscape was uniform. Centuries of human activity have altered the plain so deeply that its original appearance is difficult to reconstruct. But it can be said with confidence that the environment was always varied. Even on ground that looks flat, the movement of water creates subtle differences in elevation. Any river, canal, or long-used channel slowly builds up natural levees. Raised banks formed by deposited silt. Over time, watercourses can end up flowing slightly above the surrounding fields, and their raised edges divide the land into shallow basins. These basins may be hard to see with the naked eye, yet they decide where water pools, where it drains, and where salt accumulates. In a landscape like this, natural complexity is already high, and once countless human decisions are added, banks, cuttings, diversions, repairs, abandoned channels, the result becomes a shifting puzzle that resists easy interpretation. Left to itself, a great river on a flat plain tends to wander. It loops and bends, and in flood it breaks out of its banks. For farmers, neither habit is friendly. From very early times, people tried to restrain flooding and keep channels from drifting by, building earthen embankments and reinforcing banks. Yet, control can fail. When a river escapes human management, it may not simply flood fields for a season. It may carve a new route, leaving former channels to dry and turning other areas into marsh. Evidence for major course changes exists for both the Tigris and Euphrates. In the southern zone, multiple ancient and later channels have existed side by side at different times. Some routes that later became engineered canals appear to follow older natural beds. In other cases, medieval and early modern towns sat on channels that later fell silent. Farther north, some sections remained more stable, but tributaries could shift and redraw the relationship between cities and water. The Euphrates, in particular, has been associated with several major channel systems across historical time, diverging and rejoining in patterns that left lasting marks on settlement. What a traveller sees depends heavily on how much control people exert. In conditions with minimal intervention, the levees and mudflats near the main rivers can support thick vegetation. Trees and dense growth can flourish where fresh water is close, creating habitats for animals that have largely vanished from much of the region. As groundwater becomes more saline, away from the river influence, the vegetation changes. Some species fade, while salt-tolerant thickets can thrive wherever water lingers. In the modern south, much of the lush riverside growth that could exist under less disturbed conditions is reduced, but hardy scrub still appears in places where the land is not constantly claimed by farming or grazing. Beyond the reach of canals, cultivation ends abruptly. There is often no gradual transition from field to wilderness. Instead, the worked land stops and a raw surface takes over, hard, open ground, sometimes broken by shifting sand. Between the major rivers and the canals that branch off from them, broad strips can remain untouched by irrigation, as barren as lands beyond the alluvial plain. Such areas have long supported desert wildlife and, historically, would have offered space for grazing and movement. Yet these empty zones are not untouched in a deeper sense. Watercourses have shifted, and so has human activity. Along the edges of canals, old riverbeds, abandoned meanders, and raised levees lie the eroded remains of towns, villages, and walls. Some are worn down by wind and flood, others buried beneath silt and sand. The plain becomes a layered surface, a landscape written over again and again. With careful observation, aerial views, and patient survey work, those layers can still be read. When water has nowhere to escape, it gathers, and marshes can form quickly. The greatest wetlands lie in the south, but marsh conditions are not confined there. In different periods, waterlogged zones appeared wherever canals ended, without adequate drainage. Some famous ancient places could be reached only by boat in certain seasons, and marshland could advance or retreat depending on the balance of water input and human management. Even though swamps are unsuitable for most agriculture, they offer rich resources of their own. Fish, birds, turtles, reeds, and other materials can support communities, provide building resources, and supply trade goods. Reeds in particular are valuable across daily life, used for shelters, furniture, mats, and containers. Wetlands are not simply empty obstacles, they are living environments, and they have shaped settlement choices along their edges for millennia. This contrast between north and south created two fundamentally different agricultural worlds. In the south, farming depended on constant attention to irrigation, embankments, and canals. Fields were often organized into discrete cells supplied by a particular channel, and between those watered zones could lie strips of grazing land or outright desert. In the north, where rain made cultivation possible, the pattern was usually more continuous. The cultivated belt could spread outward until rainfall weakened, producing a more gradual fade from farmland into steppe. Between the two main centres of settlement, large areas remained difficult to farm, too dry for reliable rain crops, and too far from controlled irrigation. This included much of the Jazira, west of the Tigris, and broad lands southwest of the Hamrin. Geography also shaped contact between north and south. The separation of these two zones limited cultural, political, and military interaction to a small number of routes, where water, supplies, and relative safety made travel possible. At certain times, a line of settlement could link the foothills down through key towns and along the margins of the plains, and it was along such corridors that major overland trade often moved. Otherwise, the most dependable connections were the narrow, fertile strips beside the rivers themselves. Along these river corridors, rich soils could be watered directly, either by small channels taken off upstream or by lifting water by hand. Such river oases extended influence from the south into the north. Cities such as Mari on the Euphrates and Assur on the Tigris stood as northern outposts connected to southern culture. Their locations mattered. Each sat where the valley offered enough productive land to support a sizable population, and each gained power from the ability to supervise traffic moving up and down the river. Even with all these differences, the settled regions of Mesopotamia shared a broadly similar way of life in the periods most often discussed. Both north and south depended on farming and the stable routines that farming imposes. Communities planted, harvested, and processed grains, such as wheat and barley. Villages relied on sheep and goats, which served not only for meat, milk, and wool, but also as a form of stored wealth. Over long stretches of time, shared languages and administrative practices also bridged cultural divides. Even where different tongues were spoken in the mountains or across the wider Near East. And both regions faced recurring pressure from outside groups, tribes moving through deserts and highlands, raiders testing borders, and migrants seeking new land. The picture so far resembles the modern landscape or the world described by travellers in the last few centuries. Yet, it is unlikely that conditions stayed identical over 4,000 or 5,000 years. Environmental change can come from many directions, including natural shifts and human intervention, and evidence exists for both. Sea levels changed in the Gulf. Temperature patterns altered in ways that can be traced in mountain deposits. Vegetation history can be reconstructed through pollen records from lakes. River behaviour can be read in the landforms of foothill zones. None of these sources provides a complete answer for the alluvial plain itself, but together they suggest broad patterns that likely influence Mesopotamia's possibilities. During the last ice age, the Near East was colder than it is now, and the environment supported steppe vegetation adapted to dry conditions. Later, warming released water locked in ice and raised sea levels while also affecting rainfall. Vegetation responded differently from zone to zone. In warmer, wetter phases, tree lines could move upward into the mountains and also spread outward into steppe areas. Evidence from pollen suggests that oak forests expanded in parts of the Zagros and other northern highlands during long stretches of prehistory, though not always at the same time in every region. Elsewhere, increasing dryness could reduce woodland. By the early second millennium before the Common Era, the broad pattern of forest, steppe, and desert looks broadly recognizable. But as records approach later periods, the imprint of human activity becomes harder to ignore. Human impact is visible not only in cultivated plants, but in deforestation. Goats grazing on young growth, people gathering fuel, and the clearing of land for fields all reduce woodland. Even where royal expeditions felled timber for monumental construction, the greater force was probably the steady pull of daily demand from towns and villages. Southern rulers frequently sought timber from distant mountains. And later, northern kings also marched far to acquire suitable beams. The fact that they looked so far afield suggests that nearby hills were not heavily forested, at least not in accessible areas. Descriptions from different times imply that some routes through the uplands were already stripped of dense forests long ago. In parts of the region, the natural landscape may never have been a closed forest at all, but rather a savanna-like environment, with scattered trees and scrub, which could be greatly diminished by sustained pressure. Ancient accounts of the northern plains often emphasize openness, with dense scrub noted as a special feature rather than the norm. Blaming a single cause is too simple. Goats play a role, but so do charcoal production and commercial harvesting to meet urban needs. For the southern alluvium, the behavior of rivers may matter even more than vegetation. During the last ice age, sea levels were far lower than today, leaving much of the Gulf Basin exposed as dry land. Over time, rising seas changed the gradient and energy of the rivers. A river's speed is shaped by its slope. When a slope is gentle, a river slows, drops more silt, and meanders more. In foothill regions, stream channels show alternations between phases, when water cut downward into the land, and phases when it piled sediment upward. As the Gulf filled and sea level rose, the dynamics of erosion and deposition shifted. Rivers could cut deeper in certain upstream zones, while slowing across the plains, depositing massive alluvial layers, and building the very landscape that later societies would farm. Shoreline history in the Gulf adds another layer of complexity. The Gulf region is not geologically stable. Uplift and subsidence can reshape local conditions over thousands of years. Along much of the Gulf's length, steep coasts mean that the overall east-west boundaries did not swing dramatically after sea level rose. But at the head of the Gulf, the landscape is so flat that even small changes in sea level can move the shoreline far. For many years, it was assumed that the rivers simply pushed the shoreline steadily southward, by depositing sediment year after year. Later, work challenged that simple picture by pointing out that much of the sediment is dropped before the rivers reach open water, that tectonic shifts have occurred, and that some later field systems now lie underwater. This implies that sediment deposition and subsidence could have balanced each other in complex ways, preventing a straightforward, one-directional movement of the coastline. Yet the debate does not end there. Drillings and sediment studies have suggested that at certain periods the sea may have reached farther north than once believed, perhaps even into areas close to major early cities. Some evidence points to higher sea levels at particular times in the deep past. Others remain skeptical, because the variables are many. Sea level, river flow, sediment load, tectonic movement, and human modification of channels all interact. Without targeted field research aimed specifically at these questions, firm agreement is difficult. Still, many researchers accept that a window between roughly the 5th and 4th millennia before the Common Era saw warmer conditions and higher sea levels. It is tempting to connect these natural conditions to the rapid rise of early urban life. If rainfall increased in northern zones, settlement might have expanded southward on the rain-fed plains. If river levels were higher, irrigation might have been easier at certain seasons. If tropical weather patterns shifted, regions that are harsh today could have been less forbidding. But temptation is not proof, and the evidence remains uneven. Some reconstructions imagine the far south as once more marshy, supporting fishing and fowling communities, rather than broad agriculture, followed by a drying phase that opened new land for farmers and encouraged colonization. That scenario is possible, but it rests on scientific questions that are still debated. Even beyond the question of whether land was marsh or dry, other effects would have mattered. Temperature changes influence rainfall and vegetation. Changes in snow and ice in the mountains affect spring floods. Shifts in river regime can make irrigation easier in one season and harder in another. And across all of this, human intervention, banks, channels, clearing, grazing, can amplify or suppress natural trends. The unresolved nature of these issues is frustrating because they touch the core problem. How much of Mesopotamia's social transformation was driven by human decisions alone, and how much was shaped by changing constraints and opportunities in the environment? Without sharper understanding of ancient rainfall reliability, river behavior, and shoreline history, it remains difficult to weigh environmental influence against political innovation, technological adaptation, and economic organization. What can be said with confidence is that Mesopotamia was never a single, uniform stage. It was a mosaic of zones, rain-fed plains, irrigated alluvium, marshland, steppe, desert, and mountain edges, each with its own pressures. The civilizations that emerged there did not simply happen in a timeless landscape. They formed in a setting that demanded constant adjustment, and the land itself, shifting in subtle and sometimes dramatic ways, helped determine what kinds of societies could grow, where they could flourish, and where they would struggle to endure. The first major breakthrough in the study of Mesopotamia's earliest past came when Sir Leonard Woolley excavated a small mound called Tel al-Ubaid, a short distance north of the ancient city of Ur. On that mound stood the remains of a modest Sumerian shrine dating to the 3rd millennium, before the Common Era. But what truly changed the field was what lay beneath and around it. Among the finds was a distinctive painted pottery tradition that also appeared in the deepest layers of Ur itself. Archaeologists began to use that pottery as a marker of an early cultural horizon, and the name of the site became the label for an entire era, the Ubaid period. At the time, it seemed to represent the earliest settled presence in the southern alluvial plain, the first clear step toward the world that would later produce cities, temples, and writing. As decades passed, traces of the Ubaid horizon turned up across a widening map. Many sites could be recognized from the surface by scattered pottery, and deeper excavations began to reveal earlier stages within the same broad cultural tradition. Soundings at Eridu, at the very southern end of the plain, exposed long sequences that pushed the Ubaid story further back than first expected. More recently, work at Tel Uweli near Lhasa uncovered phases even earlier than what had once been taken as the beginning. Step by step, the Ubaid period stopped looking like a single moment and began to look like a long, formative process, with earlier and later stages showing gradual shifts rather than a sudden appearance. Even so, a striking imbalance remains between north and south. In the northern plains of Mesopotamia, settled farming life reaches much further into the past, with evidence extending thousands of years earlier than the earliest, well-attested levels in the southern alluvium. In the south, no firm archaeological horizon earlier than the Ubaid has yet been securely identified. The reason for this gap is still uncertain, and several explanations are possible, without any single one offering a complete solution. One suggestion is that the far south may not always have been equally available for stable settlement. Changes in water levels, whether from the Gulf or from the rivers themselves, could have made large areas difficult to inhabit for long periods, opening only scattered pockets of livable ground at first and only later allowing broader occupation as conditions shifted. That idea fits some broader reconstructions of the ancient landscape, but it cannot yet be pinned down with enough precision to serve as a final explanation. Another obstacle is purely geological. In parts of the southern plain, the ancient land surfaces of the 5th and 6th millennia were buried beneath later deposits of silt. If early settlements existed, some may now lie sealed below thick alluvium, invisible to ordinary excavation unless unusually deep work is undertaken. Eridu offers one of the clearest windows into how life may have changed across the early phases that can actually be seen. The deepest levels include many tools linked to hunting and fishing, suggesting that early communities depended heavily on river and marsh resources. Over time, implements associated with farming, including sickles, become more common. This looks less like a clean break and more like a gradual rebalancing of daily survival, as groups increasingly invested in cultivation, while still exploiting older sources of food and materials. On the basis of what is currently known, it is reasonable to treat the earlier Ubaid phases around 5000 before the Common Era as the point when permanent farming settlements in the far south become clearly visible in the archaeological record. That conclusion immediately raises a question that has tempted generations of scholars. Who exactly were the people behind this early southern culture, and where did they come from? Here, the evidence becomes far less secure than the confidence of many older theories might suggest. In the past, dramatic claims were sometimes made, as if changes in artifacts automatically revealed invading populations, ethnic replacements, or organized migrations. Shifts in administrative tools, seal styles, or ceramic traditions were sometimes treated as proof that a new group had pushed into the region and transformed it. Other proposals imagined waves of settlers arriving from neighbouring highlands, followed by later infiltrations by Semitic-speaking groups, whether peacefully or through conquest. Such scenarios often sounded persuasive, but they rest on assumptions that the material record cannot reliably confirm. Pots, seals, and building patterns can reveal changes in habit and organization, but they do not automatically identify language, ancestry, or ethnicity, and they cannot easily distinguish migration from imitation, trade, intermarriage, or local innovation. Behind much of this speculation lies a deeper desire to move closer to the later Sumerians, to locate an origin story that explains how a Sumerian-speaking society came to dominate the cultural landscape of the South. It has often been assumed that such a group must have arrived from outside, commonly imagined as coming from the East, and that the archaeological record should therefore contain some sign of intrusion, disruption, or cultural turnover. Different scholars have placed that imagined arrival at different points. Some have argued for a late appearance, near the end of the Uruk age. Others have pushed it back to the end of the Ubaid. Still others have claimed the Sumerians were there from the beginning. Linguistic arguments based on hints of earlier place names or borrowed vocabulary have been proposed as support, but they have never produced broad agreement. At the same time, Mesopotamian history later shows repeated entries of peoples from multiple directions. Groups from the eastern highlands and mobile populations, from the western steppe and desert. Given that pattern, it would be unwise to declare that earlier arrivals were impossible. A group could have entered quietly, merged with existing communities, and left only subtle traces in objects and architecture. Yet the deeper puzzle is not simply whether people moved, but how language and cultural authority were established. It is comparatively rare for a newly arrived community to impose its language over a larger established population. In historical times within this region, only a few languages spread with that kind of dominance across wide areas. The cultural weight of Sumerian is therefore striking, but it remains difficult to translate that fact into a clear migration story. The forces that turned the southern plain from a productive farming landscape into the earliest urban civilization are still not fully understood, and language is only one part of that wider transformation. Most of the changes that define the leap toward true urban life appear in the following era, the Uruk period. Monumental building expands dramatically. Public art becomes more visible and more complex. Production grows more specialized, with signs of standardization that imply organized labor and central planning. Writing emerges as a new technology of control and memory. Trade horizons widen, reaching far beyond the immediate riverlands. Yet the frustrating reality is that the earliest phases of the Uruk period in the south are still poorly known. Very little has been excavated that cleanly captures the opening of this era in southern Mesopotamia. Surveys have mapped where sites appear and how their distribution shifts, not only in southern Iraq but also in neighbouring Susiana, hinting at population movements and new settlement patterns. But without many deeply stratified excavations that show continuous sequences, it remains hard to connect those shifts to specific social changes, or to understand how demography, economy, and political organisation fed into one another. Still, one conclusion stands out. The transition does not look like a single catastrophic break. There is strong evidence for continuity, and nothing demands a story of sudden collapse, followed by replacement. That continuity is visible most clearly in sacred architecture. At Eridu, a famous sequence of temples shows buildings being enlarged and rebuilt repeatedly over long stretches of time. The pattern suggests persistent worship at the same location, with each phase building upon what came before. Even where later erosion and rebuilding obscure the exact plan of the final structures, the broader story remains visible. The sacred centre endures and grows. Elsewhere, deep excavations beneath major monumental platforms have revealed similar layering, with later Uruk structures built over earlier sacred spaces associated with the Ubaid horizon. It is easy to imagine that the same pattern would appear at other major sites, if excavation could reach far enough down through the mounds. In this sense, many Uruk cities were not created out of emptiness. They appear, at least in part, as developments rooted in earlier local communities. As the late Uruk phase comes into view, a different kind of evidence becomes more prominent: figurative art. This is not simply decoration, it offers scenes that seem to demand social and political interpretation. Cylinder seals begin to show images of captives, of defeated enemies, of submission and punishment, as if conflict and authority had become central themes worth recording. A ruler appears with recognizable clothing and insignia, marked out visually as a distinct figure. Similar imagery shows elite hunting, with a powerful figure confronting dangerous animals, not merely for food, but as a symbolic display of control. Temple objects carved in relief present processions and offerings, with a leading man placed close to a goddess, suggesting a link between political leadership and divine sanction. Other seals and impressions depict craftwork, organized communal activity, and coordinated production, the kinds of scenes that imply an ordered society with structured roles. Yet without contemporary written records from this same moment, such images can only be pushed so far. They hint at institutions, hierarchy, and ideology, but they do not provide names, dates, or detailed narratives. In the period that follows, Mesopotamia crosses a boundary that can reasonably be called the threshold of history. Archaeologists commonly describe the centuries between the Uruk era and the rise of the Akkadian dynasty as the early dynastic period, roughly 700 years of intense city-based development. Even here, the evidence does not allow a neat political chronicle in the style of later imperial history. The surviving sources are uneven, and many events remain difficult to reconstruct in sequence. Instead of a detailed year-by-year storyline, the era is often approached through broader outlines that show, what early Sumer looked like in the memory of those who came later. Two later works, copied and preserved by scribes long after the fact, provide a powerful image of the early city landscape. One is a collection of temple hymns that celebrate sacred places and their divine patrons, preserving a vision of a world organized around city temples and cult centers. The other is the famous king list tradition, which arranges rulership into a sequence of dynasties and cities, presenting power as something that moves from one center to another. These texts were written down in later centuries, shaped by later understandings, and cannot be treated as simple eyewitness reports. Yet they reflect a remembered reality in which temples and cities formed the core fabric of society. The temple hymn collection survives through the work of school scribes of a later age, but it claims an author of enormous symbolic importance. Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad and priestess of the moon god at Ur. The claim has been debated, and the material almost certainly includes layers of change, with later additions and edits folded into the tradition over time. Even so, the association with a named priestess and royal daughter points to how strongly later Mesopotamians linked political authority, temple leadership, and cultural memory. Some hymns appear to reflect later developments and new forms of royal devotion, suggesting that the collection continued to grow as generations reshaped it to fit new realities. In this way, the text becomes not only a window onto early Sumer as later people imagined it, but also a record of how sacred geography and political ideology were preserved, revised, and taught across centuries. Another document, famous in modern scholarship, is usually called the Sumerian King List. In the ancient world, it was known by its opening words, which begin with the dramatic claim that kingship descended from heaven. The version most often discussed today appears to have been put together not long after the collapse of the third dynasty of Ur. It sets out a chain of rulers, giving each king a stated length of reign and arranging them in dynasties, one after another, until it reaches well-known historical kings of the Ur dynasty and then continues into the line of their successors at Esin. The structure is orderly and repetitive, and it reads like an attempt to impose a single clear pattern on a complicated political landscape. The guiding idea behind the whole work is simple and powerful. Only one city at any given time could legitimately possess kingship, meaning the recognized center of supreme authority. Power is treated as something almost tangible, something that can be held by a city and then removed and carried elsewhere. In that system, the text does not imagine many equal rulers governing side by side. Instead, it presents dominance as a kind of travelling mandate. When a city loses a major struggle, the story is told in a fixed formula. The city is struck down by force, and its kingship is taken to another place. The narrative rhythm is built from these transfers. A rise in one city is matched by a fall in another, and the record moves forward as authority shifts across the landscape. Even the language used for rulers reinforces the message. The term that appears in this tradition is not simply a neutral word for a local governor. It carries the sense of a great man, a figure whose status goes beyond ordinary leadership. That choice matters because in everyday political life, many city rulers used other titles, and the dominance claimed in this list is larger than city administration. The list is describing episodes when certain cities and certain dynasties within them exercised a temporary superiority over others. The text implies that a few places, at least for a time, stood above the rest, holding a kind of overarching authority that could expand and then disappear. The selection of cities included after the Great Flood narrative also reveals what the compilers considered important. The story does not attempt to give equal weight to every settlement. Instead, It narrows the focus to a limited set of centres inside the core land, while also acknowledging a few places beyond it. The picture that emerges is not of a flat map filled with equal rivals, but of a political stage dominated by a small cast of major players. Certain cities are presented as the ones that mattered most, when the idea of kingship was at stake, while many other communities, even if powerful in their own regions, are left in the shadows. A brief example shows the style clearly. A king is introduced with a boast of conquest, described as someone who carried off enemy weapons as spoils after defeating a foreign land. Then the text assigns him an astonishingly long reign, followed by his son, also credited with a reign that stretches far beyond human reality. After listing a sequence of rulers, it totals the number of kings and the combined length of their rule down to months and fractions of days, as if precision could be achieved even in a world of impossible numbers. Then the refrain returns. The city is struck down, and kingship is carried away to the next great centre. The point is less about believable chronology and more about a pattern. The list is building a chain of legitimacy, one link after another, moving authority from city to city like an inherited object. For that reason, this work has often been recognised as something other than a neutral record of events. It is not a calm diary of what happened year by year. It is a political and ideological statement shaped into the form of history. The opening section makes this obvious at once. It begins with an entirely mythical age before the flood, populated by early cities and rulers whose reigns extend into fantastical timespans. The sequence starts in places portrayed as primeval centres of civilization, presenting them as the first recipients of divinely granted rule, long before ordinary human history begins. This introduction is not attempting to describe real administration or realistic succession. It is creating a sacred foundation for the entire concept of kingship, making authority appear ancient, cosmic, and predetermined. That mythical beginning also sets the tone for everything that follows. By framing power as a heavenly gift that descends, moves, and settles, the list encourages a particular way of seeing politics. Conflict becomes a mechanism for transferring legitimacy. Victory is not just conquest. It is proof that the mandate has shifted. Defeat is not simply loss. It is evidence that kingship has been removed. The repeated formula about cities being struck down and kingship being carried elsewhere turns messy struggles into a clean sequence. It simplifies a world that was surely full of alliances, rival claims, local powers, and overlapping influence, and replaces it with a single orderly path. The northern regions were largely associated with populations who spoke Semitic languages, especially Akkadian, and their political centre was often linked with the city of Kish. The contrast between the southern and northern worlds is difficult to define in detail because surviving records speak far more about the south than the north. Even so, the tension between these two spheres appears clearly in later traditions and stories. One of the most famous examples is the account of Gilgamesh, the legendary ruler of Uruk in the south, who is portrayed resisting the ambitions of Akka, a king of Kish. The story reflects a political rivalry that may echo real historical tensions, offering another perspective on figures such as Mesolim, a ruler with a Semitic name who intervened in southern affairs. This opposition between north and south, however, should not be interpreted as a simple division based on language or ethnicity. Speakers of both Sumerian and Akkadian lived side by side across Mesopotamia, often cooperating and sharing cultural practices. The differences were political rather than purely cultural, reflecting struggles for influence and authority rather than rigid ethnic conflict. Yet this contrast becomes especially meaningful when examining the rise of the Akkadian state. a development that reshaped the balance of power across the region. The rise of the Akkadian dynasty, founded by Sargon, marks one of the most dramatic turning points in Mesopotamian history. Later generations remembered Sargon above all as a conqueror, and stories about his achievements spread widely across the ancient Near East. Even the limited contemporary evidence confirms that his rule was defined by military success and imperial ambition. Yet these same records also suggest that his territorial control, impressive as it seemed, may not have been as deep or stable as later tradition imagined. Texts and inscriptions associated with the dynasty present a picture of vast geographical reach. They describe a world connected by trade and warfare, where ships from distant lands sailed to Akkad's harbours and armies marched far beyond the traditional heartland. Campaigns were said to reach the distant lands along the Gulf, cross into northern Mesopotamia and Syria, and extend toward the highlands of Iran and Anatolia. Such accounts suggest extraordinary expansion, yet they also raise an important question. Were these campaigns permanent conquests that brought lasting control, or were they rapid military expeditions aimed at prestige and plunder? Archaeological discoveries provide some clues. Administrative tablets linked to the Akkadian administration have been found far from the dynasty's core territory, in places such as Susa, Gasur, and Tel Brak. These finds indicate that Akkadian rulers did establish administrative centres in certain regions, at least for a time. Their presence suggests that the dynasty attempted not merely to raid distant lands, but to organise and govern them. In the south, Sargon's policies introduced a new level of centralised control. After defeating a powerful southern rival, he claimed to have destroyed the defensive walls of major cities and reorganised their political leadership. Local rulers were replaced by officials loyal to Akkad, often described as representatives of the central authority. These officials were supported by administrative personnel and military forces, ensuring the presence of Akkadian power even in regions with long-established local traditions. This transformation is visible in administrative practice. The Akkadian language began to appear in official documents, even in southern cities, that had previously used Sumerian almost exclusively. Records mention soldiers with Akkadian names stationed in key locations, suggesting that garrisons were established to maintain control. Political authority was reinforced symbolically as well. Documents were dated according to the reign of the Akkadian king, and legal agreements were sworn in his name. Even the style of writing changed, with a more formal and standardized script introduced for official use. The dynasty also sought to strengthen its authority by engaging with traditional religious institutions. Members of the royal family were installed in prominent priestly positions, linking the new political order with long-established sacred traditions. Administrative reforms extended further, including attempts to standardize systems of measurement. Previously, each city had maintained its own methods for calculating weight, length, and capacity, creating confusion in trade and administration. Under the Akkadian rulers, these varied systems were reorganized into a unified structure that remained influential for centuries. Such sweeping changes inevitably provoked resistance. Sargon portrayed himself as liberating the northern regions from southern domination, presenting his rise as a restoration of balance. Yet his rule also relied heavily on military support, and his followers expected rewards. Evidence survives showing that land was acquired for royal use, sometimes by purchase, sometimes by confiscation, and often under conditions that may have involved pressure on local populations. These actions disrupted established property relations and challenged traditional authority, creating resentment that later erupted into open revolt. After Sargon's death, uprisings broke out in several major cities. Local rulers and governors attempted to reassert independence, forcing his successors to engage in repeated campaigns to restore control. One of the most dramatic episodes occurred during the reign of Naram-Sin, who faced a widespread rebellion involving many of the major cities of Mesopotamia. He ultimately suppressed the revolt and re-established Akkadian dominance, and for a time the empire enjoyed a period of prosperity and cultural achievement. Later tradition associated Naram-Sin with the decline of the dynasty, but the state continued under his successor for several decades. Gradually, however, the empire weakened. Foreign conquests were abandoned, and new pressures emerged from outside the settled regions. Among these were groups from the eastern mountains, described as fierce and disruptive. Written records from this period are scarce, which itself reflects the instability of the time, since organized administration often collapses during periods of crisis. As Akkadian authority declined, some regions experienced a revival of local traditions. In the south, certain cities regained strength under native rulers, suggesting a resurgence of Sumerian cultural identity. Eventually, the power of the mountain tribes was challenged by a ruler of Uruk, who claimed to have driven them from the land. This victory cleared the way for a new political order. A new era began with the rise of a ruler who founded what is known as the Third Dynasty of Ur. After a period of uncertainty, he established control over much of the southern and central regions, creating a unified state that revived many earlier traditions, while introducing new forms of administration. His reign marked the beginning of a powerful dynasty that would dominate Mesopotamia for several generations. Under his successors, the realm expanded further, extending its influence into surrounding regions. Although the empire did not reach the vast scale once claimed by the Akkadian rulers, it represented a strong and highly organized state. The dynasty relied heavily on administrative control, and thousands of clay tablets recording economic transactions and official activities have survived. These documents reveal a complex bureaucracy that monitored resources, labor, and production with remarkable precision. The state developed an elaborate administrative network, including systems of communication and standardized procedures for governance. Officials were appointed to oversee cities that had once been independent, transforming them into provincial centers within a centralized system. Economic life was carefully regulated, and records were kept of even minor events, demonstrating the extraordinary reach of the government. Yet the very efficiency of this bureaucracy may have contributed to its weakness. The rigid system required constant maintenance and could become cumbersome in times of crisis. As external pressures increased, particularly from nomadic groups along the borders, the state struggled to respond effectively. Defensive measures were undertaken, including the construction of massive barriers intended to keep these groups from entering settled lands. Despite these efforts, the pressure continued to grow. Correspondence from the final years of the dynasty reveals a situation of mounting desperation. Supplies became scarce, trade routes were disrupted, and essential goods rose dramatically in price. Administrative records show evidence of severe inflation and shrinking resources. At the same time, the geographic reach of the state steadily contracted, with provincial centers falling out of central control one after another. The collapse, when it came, was complete. Later accounts attributed the fall to invasion from the east, and foreign forces briefly occupied the capital. However, the long-term beneficiaries of the collapse were new ruling groups who emerged from within the region itself. In the decades that followed, the unified state dissolved into numerous, smaller kingdoms, each ruled by its own dynasty. One of these new states presented itself as the rightful heir to the fallen empire, claiming to restore order and expel foreign occupiers. For centuries afterward, political authority in southern Mesopotamia remained fragmented, with multiple cities competing for influence. These rulers adopted traditional forms of kingship, sponsored religious institutions, and maintained irrigation systems, presenting themselves as continuers of ancient tradition even as the political landscape had fundamentally changed. The collapse also reshaped the geography of power. Some ancient cities declined or were abandoned, while new centres rose to prominence. The focus of political life gradually shifted northward, reflecting changes in economic conditions and the movement of river channels that altered patterns of agriculture. Control of water remained central to prosperity, and changes in irrigation systems could determine whether a city flourished or faded. Across South Mesopotamia, power rarely sat still. City-states rose, formed coalitions, broke them, and rebuilt them again under new terms. The struggle was not only a local contest inside Sumer and Akkad. It reached outward into the wider Near East, drawing in neighbouring kingdoms and distant allies. One region in particular kept appearing at the edge of southern politics: Elam to the east. Its role was not always obvious in older reconstructions, but the deeper the evidence runs, the clearer the connections become. Some ruling families in the south carried names and origins that point directly toward that eastern world, suggesting that the boundary between Mesopotamia and Elam was never simply a frontier. It was a corridor of movement, marriage, negotiation, and sometimes domination. At the same time, southern dynasties were tied into tribal networks that extended far beyond the alluvial plain. Names that show up as districts inside a kingdom can also reappear as tribal labels much farther north, even along the upper river regions. That kind of overlap hints at a political landscape where state and tribe were not separate categories. A dynasty could be urban and bureaucratic in its capital, yet still rooted in kinship structures and alliances that ran through steppe and river valleys. The true scale of this interconnected world becomes visible when diplomatic archives enter the scene. Letters from palace administrations reveal a political map that stretches from eastern kingdoms through northern Mesopotamia and into Syria. Alliances were not casual friendships, they were engineered systems of support. A ruler could measure his strength not only in soldiers and fortresses, but in how many other kings were bound to him by treaty, marriage, gifts, or shared interest. In this environment, a major power was rarely strong on its own. Influence often meant the ability to assemble a following, a cluster of smaller states ready to show up for a campaign, a ritual obligation, or a diplomatic crisis. By the time the best-known northern archives were being written, the southern situation had become somewhat clearer than it had been in earlier generations. A few heavyweights dominated the chessboard. One kingdom controlled much of the southern half of the land after absorbing old rivals. Another state, based farther north, emerged as the strongest power in the core Akkadian zone. A third major kingdom held the northeastern flank, positioned to control key routes and river access. Beyond this triangle, the north was far more fragmented, with a shifting field of small states, competing dynasts, and overlapping loyalties. For a long time, northern Mesopotamia seemed harder to grasp, simply because the surviving written record was thinner. Then, as the second millennium began, the situation changed sharply. Huge archives appeared in the archaeological record, and the north suddenly spoke with thousands of voices, contracts, letters, reports, and administrative lists. Some of this survival is luck, but the pattern also reflects real changes. Political and commercial horizons had shifted. New dynasties in the south were more closely linked to ruling houses elsewhere, and northern states were increasingly woven into larger systems of alliance and rivalry. In many places, Hurrian princes still held power, but Amorite dynasties were also widespread, especially towards Syria, where major kingdoms rose under Amorite leadership. This wider stage produced moments that feel almost cinematic. A king based in Syria could maintain boats on the Tigris to support allied leaders resisting pressure from the east. That detail alone shows how far alliance networks could reach. These rulers were not operating in isolated valleys. They were thinking in terms of rivers as highways, fleets as tools of diplomacy, and distant friends as strategic assets. Contact among allied dynasts was encouraged not only by shared language and ancestry, but by the basic structure of the political environment. With multiple strong states competing for dominance and many smaller polities trying to survive, alliances were not optional. They were the normal condition of politics. In the middle of all this complexity, one remarkable window opens onto Anatolia, not through royal propaganda, but through the everyday paperwork of merchants. Trading communities from Assur established commercial outposts on the Anatolian plateau, and their records show a patchwork of local rulers, kings and queens governing their towns, managing disputes, and granting trading rights. Yet these Anatolian dynasties do not appear as core players in the Mesopotamian-Syrian alliance system. The merchants negotiated carefully with local authorities, made agreements, managed risk, and tried to stay out of war. Their home city, Assur, was not yet a territorial empire. It looks more like a self-contained city with strong merchant families and civic institutions capable of controlling distant operations through law, finance, and written contracts. This is a different kind of power, not conquest, but organisation and leverage. Assur, however, did not remain untouched by the ambitions of rising warlords. An Amorite leader built a career through opportunism and calculated expansion, moving through a landscape of rival kingdoms and vulnerable cities. He captured key towns along major river routes, seized a throne in Assur, then pushed into the upper river country and established a capital in the north. He reshaped the political map not only through force but through administration, appointing sons to strategic posts, turning cities into pillars of a larger structure, and treating the region as an integrated system with multiple centres of control. The archives from Mari preserve the human texture of this world. These are not only lists and receipts, they are letters full of anxiety, persuasion, anger, and bargaining. They show rulers trying to hold coalitions together while allies wobble, defect, and return. They show how quickly loyalty could change, how often oaths were sworn, and how fragile trust could be in an environment where survival demanded flexibility. A man could pledge himself to one power, abandon it for another, then return again, leaving behind a trail of broken promises and renewed vows. Alliances were living things, constantly renegotiated, reinforced by ritual, and threatened by ambition. This is why the destruction of Mari matters so much for modern understanding. The palace fell in war and the tablets remained where they lay. The catastrophe froze an archive in place, preserving not only the documents, but traces of how they were stored and categorized. The irony is sharp. The act that ended Mari as a political centre also turned it into one of the greatest sources for reconstructing this era's diplomacy. At the centre of the southern story stands Babylon's rise under Hammurabi. Earlier in his reign, Babylon could operate as one player among several, sometimes allying with neighbours, sometimes confronting them. Then the balance shifted. A series of victories dismantled the southern competition, removed major rivals, and brought strategic northern centres under Babylonian control. The result was more than another swing in the endless cycle of city-state rivalry. Babylon began to take on the role of the primary capital of the south, in a way that outlasted the immediate moment. After this turning point, future challenges would increasingly come from outside the old system, rather than from a revived southern rival city. This does not mean Babylon's successors maintained the same reach through sheer military brilliance. Often, the opposite appears true. With rivals already eliminated and certain regions weakened or destroyed, Babylon could remain the dominant southern dynasty, even as its effective control contracted. Beyond the Euphrates, powerful kingdoms in Syria faced little direct challenge from the south. Their rulers developed their own language of international status, stepping into a new age of great power politics that would eventually involve northern empires and Egypt. Meanwhile, in the south itself, the written record begins to thin in startling ways. After a certain point, documents stop appearing in some major southern cities. In several places, the silence is not only bureaucratic but physical. Archaeology suggests a genuine break in occupation layers, as if people did not merely stop writing, but began to leave. What caused this retreat is hard to pin down with certainty, but the pattern is clear. The Kingdom of Babylon no longer controlled key southern religious and administrative centers. Life continued in the north at major sites, with evidence of steady settlement and occasional economic distress. The south, however, entered a quieter phase, not erased from history, but no longer at the heart of the political record. Yet those southern cities did not vanish permanently. Many were later reoccupied under new rulers, which shows that the region retained long-term value even when it fell out of the immediate orbit of Babylon's power. During this transition, new groups became increasingly visible on the fringes of the urban world. People from the Zagros highlands, speaking languages unrelated to Akkadian and Sumerian, appear first as occasional opponents, and later as communities living near the river routes. They could serve as labourers, hire themselves as soldiers, or form encampments close to the settled lands. Their position resembles earlier patterns, when nomadic or semi-nomadic populations hovered at the edges of agricultural territory, sometimes entering as workers, sometimes as raiders, sometimes as future rulers. In many Mesopotamian collapses, the final blow does not come from a single neat cause. Pressure builds from multiple directions, and then an unexpected shock arrives that breaks what remains of stability. When that shock comes, the written record can stop abruptly, leaving a gap that only later archives can fill. When documentation resumes, the political world often looks altered, with new dynasties, new centres, and a different balance between city and countryside. At this point, the narrative turns toward a theme that runs underneath everything described so far: writing itself. Any attempt to define complex civilization eventually runs into the need to record, transmit, and preserve information. In Mesopotamia, writing is not only a tool that reflects society, it actively shapes society. It allows orders to travel over long distances, makes agreements enforceable, and creates permanent memory for institutions that outlive individuals. It can bridge social distance by letting elites monitor resources, people, and labour across an entire region. It can also turn relationships into systems, because transactions become standardised once they are recorded in a common format that everyone recognises. Writing was not the first method humans used to keep track of goods, people, and obligations. Many societies developed their own ways of counting and storing information without permanent scripts. Some use strings, tallies, knots, or perishable devices that rarely survive in the ground. In Mesopotamia's case, hints exist that older recording methods once existed alongside early writing. Later texts even preserve echoes of counting practices and tallies, suggesting that record keeping was already part of daily life before writing took its final form. Archaeologists have also recovered clay tokens from early sites, small objects that could represent commodities and quantities. Such tools hint at a long prehistory of accounting and administration that gradually pushed toward something more powerful. The decisive change came when information began to be impressed into clay tablets, in a system that could carry meaning beyond a single object. The earliest known tablets are linked to the great temple complex at Uruk, where administration reached a scale that demanded new solutions. For a long time, Uruk's earliest tablets were treated as the first writing, mainly because nothing older was known. Over the past decades, that confidence has been strengthened in a different way. Evidence from the Uruk era shows a range of recording practices that look like direct stepping stones toward full writing. These practices appear not only in the southern heartland but also at distant sites, connected to Uruk's expansion and influence, including settlements along the Euphrates and locations on the Iranian plateau. The picture that emerges is not a sudden invention by a single genius, but a gradual assembly of tools and habits, seals, impressions, numerical marks, tokens, labels, and administrative conventions that slowly converged into a recognizable writing system. The exact sequence is difficult to prove layer by layer in every case, because archaeology does not always preserve the perfect staircase of stages. Some parts of the reconstruction rely on logical connections between different kinds of evidence, rather than a single site that contains the entire evolution in order. Even so, the overall direction is persuasive. As institutions grew larger, as trade widened, and as temple and palace economies demanded tighter control, the old methods of memory and tally were no longer enough. Clay offered permanence, and standardized signs offered speed. Once those two elements fused into a workable system, record keeping could move from local counting to complex administration. From that point on, the written record became the main channel through which Mesopotamia speaks across millennia. Not because everything was written down, but because the things that mattered most to institutions were the very things most likely to be pressed into clay. At a certain point, record keeping in Mesopotamia stops being only numbers. The clay begins to carry something more, marks that stand for things, actions, and categories. The earliest true tablets combine counted quantities with drawn symbols. Some of those symbols clearly echo older three-dimensional counters that had once been used to track goods. It is as if an earlier system of physical objects slowly stepped onto the surface of the tablet and turned into a visual language. At first, this breakthrough appears most clearly at one major center. That does not mean it happened only there. Early pictorial signs show up beyond the southern plain, and the spread of the idea may simply be underrepresented in what survives. But the overall trajectory is hard to miss. A system built around counting and commodities, protected by sealing wet clay, becomes a system capable of carrying meaning through signs. Once that door opens, it does not stay half-closed. The sign inventory expands quickly, growing from a practical shorthand into a complex and ambitious script. The earliest tablets contain an enormous variety of symbols. Only a small part of that catalogue can be traced back to the old, physical counters. Most of the signs look like simplified drawings. A head, a jar, a tool, a plant, an animal, a container, a building. Many are still recognizable as pictures, even if the hand that drew them allowed plenty of variation. That freedom doesn't last long. Scribes begin to organize the signs, list them, and repeat them in standard ways. Within a relatively short time, the shapes become more consistent, and the same set of signs starts to appear across multiple settlements in the south. This is one of the clearest hints that writing, once formed, quickly became an agreed system rather than a private experiment. At roughly the same broad moment, writing appears in other parts of the Old World. In the lands east of Mesopotamia, a local script emerges that clearly shares the logic of the Mesopotamian example, even if it develops its own look. Farther away, the Indus world also produces an independent system, likely later, and possibly encouraged by contact and imitation rather than direct copying. In Egypt, the first scripts arrive early too, but the pathway looks different. Instead of a long trail of earlier accounting devices leading into writing, the Egyptian evidence feels more sudden. At the same time, objects connected with Mesopotamian practice begin to appear there, suggesting that the idea of writing and certain administrative tools travelled even when the scripts themselves did not. Ancient storytellers later imagined this shift as a moment of invention, a scene where a figure presses words into clay as though the world had suddenly learned a new power. These myths capture the sense of astonishment that writing must have produced, because the real revolution was not only the signs, it was the tablet itself. Once the clay tablet is adopted, it becomes the heart of the entire written tradition. The script is shaped by its material from the beginning. Clay is available almost everywhere, it is easy to prepare, and it is cheap. People record more when the medium does not feel precious. And for modern archaeology, clay has another advantage. Even when tablets are not fired in a kiln, the dry heat can harden them enough to survive for thousands of years. A broken tablet has no value to the person discarding it. So unwanted texts end up in rubbish pits, floor fill, collapsed rooms, or storage spaces where they wait for excavation. The material is not perfect. Tablets are heavy. They are bulky. When a text is long, it cannot simply run on endlessly, the way ink can on a scroll. It must be divided across multiple pieces of clay. Some administrative tablets grow huge and handling them becomes awkward. A large tablet can feel more like a brick than a page. In certain contexts, it is easy to imagine a second person helping, holding, and turning the tablet while the scribe works. Later, administrations, needing lighter tools for extended writing, turn to wooden boards coated in wax, which allow entries to be added and changed. But in earlier periods, the clay tablet dominates, and that dominance shapes what kinds of records survive in great quantity. The tablet also forces discipline. Clay can only be written on at the right moment, when it is damp enough to take impressions, but not so wet that the signs collapse. In a hot summer, keeping clay workable is a skill in itself. As a tablet dries, the marks become shallower and harder to press cleanly. Corrections can be made while the surface is still soft by smoothing and reworking the clay. But once it dries, the text becomes fixed. Additions become clumsy or impossible unless someone scratches them in afterward. This makes tablets excellent for final records and legal documents, but poor for running logs that need constant updating. That limitation helps explain why eras that rely heavily on clay tablets can leave enormous archives of fixed statements, while other periods may prefer more flexible writing surfaces that do not survive as easily. How tablets were stored depended on the institution. Some palaces kept them on shelves, and when buildings burned or collapsed, the tablets fell in piles that still preserve hints of their original order. In other places, excavations recovered huge numbers of tablets, but recorded almost nothing about where they came from inside a room. Temples in later times built organized storage systems into their walls, creating compartments like pigeonholes. Smaller collections were often kept in wooden or reed chests. Those containers do not survive, but the clay labels attached to them sometimes do, describing what was inside. Tablets were also stored in jars, especially in trading communities, where sealed containers protected private correspondence and contracts. Long before writing, sealing had already proved its value. A seal pressed into wet clay could lock a door, secure a container, or mark goods in a way that could not be altered once it hardened. When writing and sealing finally combine into a single documentary practice, the result is powerful. A written text carries the message. The seal adds authority and protection. Even someone who cannot read can participate by using a personal seal to confirm a transaction. But this combination did not become universal overnight. Seals might be used on doors and jars for centuries, without being placed on tablets. In some periods, sealing written documents is rare, then it returns gradually and becomes standard. One early solution was to write on clay that wrapped around a symbolic object, such as a peg used to represent a house transfer. The inscription explains the deal, and the seal impression confirms that an authority witnessed it. Over time, the practice shifts so that the person responsible for the transaction, the seller or the debtor, becomes the one who seals the document. Another major step is the clay envelope. A tablet can be covered in a thin layer of clay, creating an outer shell that hides and protects the inner text. This has two purposes. A private letter can travel sealed, its message concealed. A legal document can be protected against tampering by repeating the text on both inner tablet and outer envelope. If someone tries to alter one version, the mismatch exposes the fraud. The logic is simple and durable, and similar ideas appear again and again in later legal cultures in different materials. As all of this develops, the writing itself changes shape. Early signs are drawn more freely, with curves and pictorial detail. Over time, they become impressed rather than drawn. A cut reed pressed into clay produces a wedge, and the script begins to favour wedge-shaped strokes. The tool and the medium reshape the signs until many of them no longer resemble the objects they once pictured. Even inscriptions carved into stone begin to mimic the wedge marks of clay, showing how strongly the tablet dictates the look of the system. There is also a shift in how the text is laid out. When signs are still pictures, they make most sense when oriented upright, like the objects they represent. That arrangement encourages writing in columns. Later, as signs become abstract wedges, the script flows more naturally across the surface in horizontal lines. The change does not happen in a single day. Monumental inscriptions can preserve older conventions, while everyday writing moves toward a new habit. But eventually, the left-to-right line becomes the standard way the script is read and taught. Simplification continues at every level. Scribes prefer a limited set of wedge directions, because turning the stylus or the tablet is awkward. Vertical strokes, horizontal strokes, and a small number of angled impressions become the building blocks from which most signs are formed. Complex pictorial combinations are reduced, and a sign that once tried to show multiple ideas inside a single picture becomes a pair of simpler signs placed side by side. The total number of signs drops over time, and although the system remains large, only a smaller core is used constantly in everyday records. These changes are not only about speed or style, they also reflect a deeper transformation in how writing connects to language. In its earliest form, the script is best at naming things. Sheep, grain, containers, measures, tools, people. It struggles with grammar, tense, case, and the invisible machinery of speech. Early texts can function as prompts and reminders for people who already know the context. The signs help the reader reconstruct meaning rather than spelling everything out. Gradually, a solution emerges that changes everything. Signs begin to represent sound as well as meaning. If two words sound alike, a sign for one can be borrowed to write the other. This method allows writing to express abstract ideas that cannot be drawn easily. It also allows a script to grow beyond lists and accounts into richer language. As sound-based writing expands, more grammatical details appear on the tablet, not because the spoken languages suddenly become more complex, but because writing finally finds a way to capture that complexity. This shift matters even more when different languages share the same writing system. One language may be relatively easy to render, with signs that represent whole words and added endings. Another language may require more sound-based spelling because its grammar depends on internal changes to word patterns, rather than simple endings. That creates pressure to push the script further towards syllables and phonetic values. In other words, the needs of scribes writing different languages can actively drive the evolution of the writing system itself. The cuneiform system had become flexible enough to work like several tools at once. A single sign could function in 3 different ways, and the reader had to decide which role it was playing. Sometimes a sign represented sound, standing for a syllable that could be combined with others to spell a word. Sometimes the same sign stood for an entire word or idea, more like a symbol than a piece of spelling. And sometimes it acted like a silent label, placed before a word to guide the reader, marking what kind of thing was coming next. One sign might be read as a spoken syllable in one line, then appear in another line where it is not pronounced at all, only signalling that the following name belongs to a certain category, such as a deity. The meaning is not carried by the mark itself alone, but by the position it occupies in the sentence and by the habits of the scribal tradition behind it. This is one reason cuneiform can look intimidating today. A single sign may carry several possible sounds and several related meanings, because the system grew over centuries through practical adaptation rather than by clean design. In the scribal world that produced these texts, however, the confusion was more manageable than it seems now. A community of scribes working in the same region at the same time shared conventions about which values were normal in which genres. Context did much of the work. A legal contract, a hymn, and a private letter were not written in exactly the same style, even when the clay and the wedge marks were the same. In some settings, a strongly word-based tradition remained fashionable, using many signs as full words. In other settings, especially when scribes wrote in everyday Akkadian for letters, business, and narrative literature, the script leaned heavily towards sound spelling. That shift reduced the number of signs a writer needed in regular use, because a syllabic approach can reuse a smaller toolkit to build many different words. This practical tendency becomes even clearer in commercial environments. Merchant scribes, focused on speed, clarity, and repeatable formats, often preferred a stripped-down writing practice that relied on a limited group of syllabic signs. Instead of memorizing a vast catalogue of elaborate symbols, they used a compact set of signs again and again, inserting only a few traditional logograms, where convenience demanded it, such as for common commodities. It was not that they were less capable. It was that their world rewarded efficiency over display, and writing was expected to serve communication rather than ceremony. The relationship between writing and society also evolved slowly. The first tablets were not born as literature, law codes, or personal diaries. They began as tools for management. Early documents are dominated by accounting. Lists of goods, tallies of deliveries, counts of animals, measures of grain. They speak in the language of institutions that had to control resources and labour. Even when the earliest tablets cannot be read line by line with full confidence, the kinds of signs used and the repeated formats reveal their purpose. They track commodities. They record transfers. They represent a system trying to make a large organisation legible to itself. A second category appears early as well: exercises and sign lists, the foundation of scribal training. These texts are not creative writing in the modern sense. They are tools of the craft, mapping the sign system, organizing it, and drilling it into memory. They show that writing did not spread only because rulers wanted records, but also because specialists were being trained, and that training created its own traditions, its own curriculum, and its own way of thinking about language. In the earliest centuries, most surviving writing still clusters around large centers of power and worship. Temples and palace-like institutions had strong reasons to write. They moved resources, fed workers, received offerings, and stored wealth. Outside those settings, early writing is rare. That does not mean ordinary people had no dealings worth recording. It suggests that the cost of scribal labour and the authority of documentation belonged mainly to institutions at first. In places where early numerical tablets have been found beyond the core homeland, it is reasonable to imagine they recorded trade and supply activities, perhaps linked to colonies, expeditions, or outposts. Even then, the style remains consistent with bookkeeping, not storytelling. As time passes, writing begins to escape the strict boundaries of institutional accounting. One of the earliest clear expansions is into legal life, especially transactions involving land and property. Short, blunt inscriptions appear on durable materials, recording purchases and ownership changes. They are not long texts. They are the minimum needed to make a deal public, memorable, and enforceable. This is a turning point because it shows writing being used not merely to manage a temple economy, but to define rights between people. Even when such early legal records survive only in fragments and lack perfect excavation context, their existence signals that writing is becoming socially useful beyond storage rooms and offering lists. At the same time, it is important not to imagine an overnight transformation. For long stretches, the surviving tablets remain heavily utilitarian. Even when writing is clearly continuous, whole periods can look thin simply because the deepest archaeological layers are difficult to reach, or because later, building activity disturbed early deposits. The record is uneven, and silence can be misleading. Still, the broad direction is visible. Accounting comes first, then training texts, then early legal and commemorative uses, and only later does writing spread into the full range of functions people now associate with it. The key point is that writing does not simply mirror society. It changes society. Once an institution can store decisions and obligations in clay, it can govern differently. It can track supplies across distance and time. It can audit officials. It can freeze agreements into stable forms. It can create memory that outlasts a single person's authority. As these advantages become obvious, new uses accumulate slowly, each one building on the last, until writing becomes a normal part of administration, law, diplomacy, and eventually literature. Early Mesopotamia stands out for many reasons, but two features always dominate the first impression: the rise of cities and the spread of writing. Those two facts shape almost everything that can be known today. Most written documents were produced in urban centres, stored in urban archives, and preserved because cities were where durable buildings stood and where clay tablets accumulated. Even the countryside appears mainly through an urban lens because records about fields, herds, taxes, labour, and disputes were created by people whose desks were inside city walls. Rural life is visible, but usually only at the moments when it touches city interests, such as rent contracts, service obligations, recruitment, and the control of water and land. Where the written record remains silent, archaeology offers another angle, but it is often limited to the pattern of settlements across the landscape. For food, labour, animals, and raw, for food, labour, animals, and raw materials, and the countryside depended on the city for administration, protection, ritual authority, and trade connections. This tight relationship is one reason that urban records, despite their bias, can reveal more about rural systems than might be expected. In certain periods, diplomatic letters and state correspondence also throw light on groups who lived beyond settled fields, especially mobile communities on the edges of the cultivated world. These letters suddenly widen the stage, showing that the city world constantly negotiated with people who did not live like city dwellers. When people ask what makes a settlement a city, the first question is usually size. Archaeologists often answer by measuring the area of occupation or the size of the mounds left behind. That method has limits because the preserved footprint of a settlement can reflect later building, erosion, or incomplete survey. Even so, mapping settlement size across a region reveals a hierarchy. Many small sites and a smaller number of places that stand out as much larger. In some periods, this top tier looks like a distinct category. The threshold is not fixed through time. A city in one era might be larger or smaller than a city in another. What matters is its position in the settlement hierarchy and the functions it seems to have served. Function is harder to read than size, but certain clues recur. A major shrine can signal centrality, because religious focus often gathered people, resources, and authority into one place. Political centrality leaves another signature: walls. Fortification is not unique to cities, but in Mesopotamia, walls became a kind of statement. They protected inhabitants, but they also declared collective identity. Rulers boasted about building walls, repairing them, deepening moats, shaping bricks, raising ramparts higher than before. When a city fell in war, the destruction of its fortifications was a repeated act, not just a practical measure, but a symbolic stripping of power. City walls also reveal a basic problem of urban life. A wall can become a cage. Over time, a walled settlement might find itself cramped, with occupation layers rising higher and higher inside the enclosure while surrounding land remained lower. One solution is to allow suburbs to grow beyond the wall, accepting vulnerability or relying on negotiated security. Another solution is to redraw the wall line to enclose a larger space. Some cities show evidence of early cores later surrounded by much larger enclosures, suggesting a burst of planned expansion. That expansion does not always mean simple population growth. Political shifts can drive it. A new ruling group, especially one arriving from outside, might require administrative buildings, residences for officials, space for storage, and facilities for control, all difficult to squeeze into an old, dense core. A city that becomes a regional headquarters can swell for administrative reasons, even if its resident population does not multiply at the same rate. Inside the walls, city life was not uniform. It is tempting to imagine a dense blanket of houses filling every corner, clustered neatly around a temple or palace. Reality was messier. Some large enclosures held fields, groves, gardens, workshops and industrial zones as well as residences. Certain cities may have enclosed open land on purpose, preserving space for cultivation, brickmaking, or future growth. Even when a shrine remained central, the distribution of housing and activity could be uneven, shaped by politics, terrain, water management, and long-term changes in the city's role. One of the most difficult questions is whether crafts clustered into recognizable quarters. It seems intuitive that crafts would concentrate because skills often passed within families, and families tended to stay near each other. Yet clear proof is rare. Tablets are most likely to survive where literacy was common and archives accumulated, so merchants, temples, and schools are far easier to see than potters, smiths, and dyers. Archaeology sometimes helps. Waste from pottery production can spread over large areas, and concentrations of specialized debris can suggest zones where shell, stone, or other materials were worked. Even then, it is hard to tell whether such zones belong to large institutions or to private producers. A cluster of production could reflect state workshops, neighborhood craft traditions, or both. Commerce raises another uncertainty. Where did buying and selling happen inside a Mesopotamian city? Modern Middle Eastern towns are famous for covered markets and specialized streets. Ancient evidence is more ambiguous. Some words seem to refer to open spaces or broad streets, and city gates were certainly public places where people gathered, disputes were heard, and announcements circulated. Yet clear archaeological identification of a marketplace is difficult, and written sources do not always describe commercial districts in the way later cities might. Merchants are visible, and so are harbours and quays where goods arrived and were unloaded. In time, merchant communities could become organised bodies with shared identity and collective interests. But that does not automatically prove the existence of a single, centralised market square in the modern sense. Population is even harder to estimate than area. Texts rarely give totals for a whole city. They mention troops, temple personnel, or specific workforces. But these are only slices of society. Archaeologists, therefore, try indirect methods. One approach applies population densities drawn from later traditional towns, but the results are broad and uncertain. Another approach looks at housing block by block. The size and spacing of houses, the share of space devoted to courtyards and storage, the possibility of upper stories, and the evidence of activities inside rooms. This method is slow and depends on good excavation, but it offers more control. It also reveals that one city's density may not match another's. Even within a single city, dense neighbourhoods can exist alongside open zones, industrial areas, gardens, or empty land. For a city to operate as a community, it also needed institutions that could coordinate action. Early Mesopotamian tradition preserves the idea of assemblies where decisions were debated, where elders and younger men offered advice, and where consensus mattered. Later texts sometimes depict the gods themselves holding councils, a mythic reflection of a human political model. Over time, as kingship strengthened and palace administration expanded, the political role of assemblies appears to shrink or transform, surviving most clearly in legal contexts, rather than in state policy. Yet traces remain that city communities did not begin as passive crowds ruled only from above. Collective decision-making had a place, even if its power faded or was absorbed into new forms of authority. Below the citywide level, neighbourhoods mattered. In later periods, cities could be divided into wards or quarters, each represented by leading household heads and a local official comparable to a mayor. The names of these neighbourhoods sometimes point to earlier connections with gates, hinting that physical layout and administration were linked. Documents occasionally list residents by ward, offering a glimpse into how populations were categorised and supervised. These lists raise further questions. How large a ward was, whether it was based on kinship, occupation, or geography, and how it related to older social groupings, such as clans. The evidence suggests tension between topographical divisions designed for administration and kin-based identities that did not always map neatly onto city streets. Kinship groups larger than the household appear in scattered references, especially in earlier periods. Some texts speak of clans or named groups that could provide labour, organise people under banners, or hold land in some collective form. In a few cases, records mention large numbers of youths, drawn from multiple such groups, implying units made up of several families each. Over time, the documentation becomes more narrowly legal and administrative, and social categories that mattered in everyday life can become harder to see. It is not always clear whether the categories disappeared or simply stopped being written down. Beyond the walls, the city's territory was not an afterthought. Fields, canals, herds, and villages were part of the same administrative world. In some eras, archives from major cities are dominated by rural affairs. Plough teams, irrigation maintenance, grain, labour drafts, and land allotments. Settlement surveys suggest that at certain times, population clustered into cities, while small settlements thinned out. Yet villages could return and flourish, and when they did, they often managed local matters through their own councils of elders and local officials. Villages could even carry collective legal responsibility for events within their territory. Day-to-day decisions about water access, field schedules, and fallow land were likely handled locally, even when the village was politically subordinate to a city. Outside settled land lay the spaces that cities feared and needed at the same time: steppe, desert, and mountain zones. Mobile groups lived there with different degrees of attachment to towns. Mountain herders could move seasonally without necessarily pressing hard on the alluvial plains. Desert pastoralists were another matter. Their seasonal grazing needs brought them near fields and canals, and their mobility made them difficult to regulate. City dwellers often described them with hostility, portraying them as outsiders who did not live in houses, who ate differently, and who could appear as raiders. Yet the economic relationship was not purely antagonistic. Herding communities provided animals, wool, and transport. They could graze flocks on stubble, herd animals for villagers, supply donkeys for work and caravan travel, and guide routes across difficult country. In some areas, long-distance routes to the west depended on local expertise and animals controlled by desert tribes. Over centuries, new tribal names appear in the sources and then fade. These groups were often identified by lineage and tribal affiliation, rather than by fixed territory. Such identity mattered politically as well as socially. Ruling families might preserve ancestral names and traditions long after becoming thoroughly urban in lifestyle, using them to claim legitimacy and to connect themselves to wider networks beyond their city. At times, political authority rested on a dual base: a settled city population on one hand, and a mobile or semi-mobile tribal following on the other. Kings could be described as ruling both, and their choices of display, transport, and ceremonial behaviour were shaped by that dual identity. The relationship between mobile groups and the settled world was not a simple march from nomadism to civilization. Intermediate forms were common. A tribe might contain a sedentary segment, living in villages and cultivating land, while other segments moved seasonally with flocks. Migration routes could be regular, with recognized encampment zones and negotiated grazing rights. Yet disputes were inevitable, where boundaries were loose and the pressure for pasture was high. In stable times, individuals from mobile communities could also enter the service of cities as guards, labourers, couriers, or mercenaries. Records sometimes show such groups receiving rations, suggesting formal ties with the state. Another path into settled life was land allotment, since states often rewarded fighters and retainers with plots, tying mobile manpower to fixed territory. In the last few decades, historians have become far more precise when talking about how people actually lived together in the past. That precision matters for Mesopotamia too, even though the surviving documents rarely provide the kind of numbers modern demographers love. Average family size, life expectancy, detailed age profiles, or clear statistical change over centuries. The evidence is uneven, but the questions are still worth asking, and the first step is to separate two concepts that are often mixed together: A family is a web of relationships created by birth and marriage. Its edges are naturally blurry because kinship can stretch far, and close relatives are not defined the same way in every society. A household is different. A household is the people who share a living space and run daily life together as a unit. Those who sleep under one roof, eat from the same stores, work within the same walls, and depend on the same domestic routines. For administrators and for archaeologists, the household is easier to handle because it has clearer boundaries at any given moment. The family can extend beyond those walls, remain socially powerful, and still leave a faint trace in the material record. It is common to describe households using labels like nuclear and extended, but those labels can mislead if they suggest only two rigid types. Real communities contain many intermediate forms, and the same domestic group can change over time as people marry, die, migrate, prosper, or fall into hardship. Some households are built around one married couple and their children. Others add extra relatives, such as an unmarried sister, a widowed mother, or an aging parent who needs support. Some contain more than one married couple under the same roof, creating a multi-family household. The key point is movement. A house can begin as a small unit and grow into something more complex, or begin large and later split into smaller units. The physical houses of Mesopotamia make this discussion feel tangible. In most periods, the basic building materials were local and familiar. Mud brick, mud plaster, roofs formed from earth and wood, doors and frames carved from timber. The craftsmanship, however, could be careful and high quality. Walls were thick and solid, floors were plastered with attention, and courtyards were laid out with planning rather than improvisation. In some later urban phases, the lower courses of walls might be built in more durable, fired brick to resist damp rising from the ground. Bitumen and lime plaster sometimes appear as special materials, but the essential point is that the raw ingredients were not rare luxury goods. The real value of a city house lay in its location. The plot itself, the right to occupy it, and its position within a crowded neighborhood. Many third millennium city houses were large and thoughtfully arranged around a central courtyard. The bigger the house, the easier it becomes to see division of function. A space for receiving guests, a domestic wing for everyday living, areas for food preparation, places where water installations and hearths appear with regularity. Some activities remain hard to identify even when the plan is clear. Storage can be subtle. Animal keeping leaves traces that are not always easy to detect, but careful excavation and improved techniques increasingly allow archaeologists to distinguish what was cooked where heavy work was done, which corners saw repeated burning, and how movement flowed through the building. A striking long-term shift appears when comparing house size across time. Early urban houses in some towns can be very large, while many later second millennium city houses are much smaller on average. The cause is not obvious. Crowding in thriving cities might be part of the story, but documents also mention empty plots and waste ground, often enough to suggest that space pressure alone cannot explain everything. Another possibility is social change. Wealth and influence moving away from older urban households toward palace structures and state-controlled institutions, or long economic trends that made ordinary urban life more constrained. Yet even that does not fully explain shrinking houses, because respectable building materials were not expensive in themselves. This makes it tempting to consider another explanation: a shift in residential patterns, meaning changes in how households were structured and how many people lived and worked together within one domestic unit. In theory, archaeology should be ideal for answering that question because house plans reflect households more directly, than extended kin networks. In practice, it remains difficult to calculate the number of occupants in a specific house or the intensity of cooperation between them. Were multiple generations living together, or did married sons usually establish separate residences? Did several related households occupy adjoining plots and function as a single cooperative group? Or did they operate independently despite proximity? These questions push the limits of architecture alone, and that is why written sources are still crucial. Even the documents raise a difficult problem. Legal and administrative texts often focus on property rights, and property does not always mirror residence. A broader kin group can share claims to land or houses without living together. A household can split into separate houses without weakening the social force of the wider family network. Urban life, in particular, tends to push families apart, because space is finite, and inherited plots cannot expand endlessly. Rural life makes co-residence easier. Land is more available, and a larger group can remain together while cultivating fields jointly. Yet even when urban households separate physically, the extended family can remain socially significant in marriage strategy and in the long-term control of land. Archaeology sometimes hints at earlier forms of residence that may have been more collective. Some early neighbourhood layouts suggest self-contained enclosures separated by lanes, which could represent larger co-resident groups. A few early sale documents also hint that relatives lived close to one another and that kin and neighbourhood overlapped. Clear proof is rare, but the pattern is plausible, especially in phases when cities were newly established or rebuilding after disruption. By later periods, the picture becomes clearer in the written record. In many old Babylonian towns, domestic identity is strongly shaped by patrilineal descent and patrilical residence. Men are typically identified through their father's name, reflecting the importance of the male line. Having a son and heir mattered intensely. A son supported parents in old age and was expected to care for the dead through ongoing rites. Childlessness created anxiety and legal creativity. Adoption becomes one solution, fully recognized and carefully regulated. Another solution is to acknowledge children born to a household slave woman, bringing them into the recognized line in a way that protected inheritance and continuity. Wives also negotiated protection for their own position through arrangements that could supply heirs and reduce the risk of divorce under certain conditions. Children typically remained in the father's house until marriage or the creation of a new household. Distribution lists and ration texts, where they exist, can offer a rare window into what a household contained in practice. Many households appear to consist of a couple with children, sometimes enlarged by an unmarried sister, a widowed mother, or a younger brother still under the household head's authority. These texts often show a domestic unit that is not a vast compound packed with multiple married couples, but a smaller, more manageable structure. Slaves may be present, and in some cases a slave woman and her children appear in a way that suggests concubinage or semi-integrated status rather than a completely separate conjugal unit. The fact that many urban households are small does not mean extended families vanish. Land ownership tells a more complicated story. In early periods, evidence from land sales shows that relatives of a seller sometimes received portions of the purchase payment, and transactions can involve groups of brothers or wider clusters of kin acting together. Large inscriptions recording royal land purchases can list extensive sets of related owners and distinguish primary owners from other kin with recognized claims. This suggests that property could be treated as belonging to a wider kin group, even if daily residence was divided across multiple houses. There are practical reasons why families might resist splitting agricultural land. Equal division across generations can fragment holdings into pieces too small to manage efficiently. Agricultural cycles can require alternating fallow, meaning a viable holding must be spread across more than one area. Access to irrigation water can depend on rights attached to specific plots, making fragmentation even more destructive. Faced with these pressures, families in many agrarian societies adopt strategies, favouring one heir more strongly, keeping property jointly owned, or cultivating communally even when legal ownership becomes complicated. Mesopotamia fits this broader pattern, and joint cultivation could preserve both productivity and family cohesion. Later, evidence becomes more uneven. In some southern regions and periods, sale documents for fields are rare, making it difficult to trace changing patterns through direct transactions. Lease documents can still reveal joint ownership, suggesting that extended kin groups remained significant, even when land was not being sold openly. Inheritance texts also show that divisions could be planned on paper, but delayed in practice, with physical separation occurring later. At the same time, some scholars emphasize that legal texts often present property as belonging to individuals, rather than diffuse kin groups. This is not necessarily a contradiction. Law and bureaucracy prefer clarity. Administrations want one named owner. Courts want one responsible party. That preference can push extended families into the background of documentation, even if they remain socially active. The disappearance of relatives from later sale documents does not automatically prove that relatives stopped mattering. It may simply mean the legal record no longer needed to mention them. When a household head died, the default pattern in cities was division of the estate among sons, or more precisely among surviving male lines. The property could include almost anything durable: fields, parts of a house, furniture, animals, slaves, debts owed, obligations owed to the state, and even rights tied to temple service. These documents can be astonishingly detailed, listing objects that modern readers would never expect to appear in an inheritance settlement. They also reveal the underlying logic. A male line continues through sons, and the children of a deceased son can inherit in his place, which could trigger bitter disputes over legitimacy. Paternity could become a legal battlefield when a posthumous child threatened the expectations of uncles. Two major modifications often complicate the equal shares idea. First, a father could make gifts during his lifetime that did not always count as part of the later division. This matters especially for daughters, because marriage often required the father to provide a dowry. If a father died before doing so, sons might be obliged to set aside property to complete that obligation. Once a dowry moved with a daughter into another household, it effectively shifted wealth toward another line unless circumstances brought it back, such as a death without sons. A daughter dedicated to a religious role could also create complex claims, because brothers might support her and later expect to recover her property, while she might try to redirect it through adoption or other legal devices. Second, local custom could favour the eldest son. He might receive an extra share, claim a defined preferential portion, or gain the right to choose first, while other shares were allocated by lot. Urban real estate made these issues especially difficult. A city house could be too small to divide cleanly. Its walls were bounded by neighbours. Expanding outward might be impossible. As a result, inheritance documents sometimes contain what look like tiny transfers of house space, not because people were constantly trading property, but because legal paperwork was used to equalize shares when architecture forced uneven partitions. The eldest son often had a strong claim to the family house for another reason: ritual responsibility. In many periods, the dead were buried beneath the floors of houses. Separate cemeteries existed too, but intramural burial was common, and this practice tied ancestry to property in the most literal way. Households performed memorial rites over graves, water poured, food offered, names spoken, and the dead acknowledged as members of the continuing line. In some cases, terracotta pipes were built to channel libations down toward the burial space, providing a physical mechanism for a ritual act that repeated through generations. The core idea was continuity. Caring for ancestors was not only piety, it reinforced identity and legitimacy within a patrilineal system. When prayers list ancestors by name, they show memory turning into a structured declaration of descent. Alongside graves and memorial rites, evidence appears for domestic shrines inside houses. A small altar platform might stand in a corner of a room, sometimes near a hearth. Its design could echo temple architecture in miniature. Such a space might serve the personal deity of the household head, or a protective deity associated with the family group. Written sources rarely describe these intimate practices directly, but private devotion is hinted at through routine expressions and personal theophoric names. In Mesopotamia, religion was not only civic and monumental, it also lived quietly inside the home, tied to lineage, protection, and daily uncertainty. Marriage shows the extended family at work in another way. Marriage was not only the union of two individuals, it was the forging of a relationship between households and wider kin groups. Among ruling families, it could be openly political, but the same principle operated at local level through prestige, alliances, and economic calculation. The written record does not always reveal the social negotiations behind marriages, because legal documents focus on property and dispute, not on the full social story. Still, some memoranda and accounting records show how long and resource-heavy the process could be, stretching over months. Gifts might be delivered in stages. Food and drink could be provided for visits and ceremonies. Feasts marked turning points. Oils, textiles, animals, and other valuables moved as part of the broader negotiation between families. The marriage process can be imagined as a sequence rather than a single moment. There could be an initial betrothal, followed by reinforcing exchanges from both sides. Then, the physical move of the bride to her new household, and finally, the establishment of cohabitation. Delays were normal. Practical arrangements took time. Resources had to be gathered. In some cases, the bride or groom might be young, making full marriage a phased transition rather than an instant change. Legal texts highlight one crucial issue: how society defined marriage. A marriage could be recognized through formal agreement and a public act, such as a feast, even if the full domestic reality of cohabitation came later. The agreement itself did not necessarily depend on a written tablet. In many societies, the binding force comes from spoken formulae, witnesses, and symbolic acts, rather than from writing. Mesopotamian law preserves the sense that speech could create or dissolve status. Divorce could be enacted through explicit verbal repudiation. Some ritual texts echo the power of formal spoken lines that declare two people, husband and wife. The point is not romance. The point is social fact. A household is a legal and economic entity, and words, witnessed and recognized, could bring that entity into being. Through all these fragments, a consistent picture emerges. The household is the unit that can often be seen most clearly, both in ruins and in documents. The family is wider, more flexible, and harder to trace, yet it continues to shape inheritance, marriage, and land. Cities pressure households towards smaller residential units, while the countryside offers space for larger co-resident groups. Law and bureaucracy prefer individuals, Yet social life often runs through kin networks that do not fit neatly into legal categories. Mesopotamian society, like many others, lived in the tension between those two realities: the tidy record and the messy human web behind it. Marriage in ancient Mesopotamia was never simply a private relationship between two individuals. It was primarily an agreement between families, often negotiated by the fathers who represented their households. The spoken promises exchanged by the bride and groom marked a personal bond, but the decisive agreement concerned rights, property, and lineage. What the groom's family secured through negotiation and payment was not ownership of the bride as a possession, but a recognized claim to her place within their household and their future descendants. A payment from the groom's side formed part of this arrangement. In later periods, this contribution was often made in silver, while in earlier times it could take the form of goods or livestock. The meaning of this payment has long been debated. It was not a straightforward purchase. In many cases, the sum was later returned or balanced through other exchanges, suggesting that it functioned more as a pledge of commitment, a guarantee that the agreement would be honoured by both sides. It marked the seriousness of the union and the obligations that accompanied it. After the agreement was reached, the process of marriage could unfold slowly. A girl might remain in her father's household for some time, particularly if she was still young. In other cases, she moved to the home of her husband's family and lived under the authority of her father-in-law. Household records from some cities list such brides living within their new domestic setting, showing that marriage could begin as a gradual transition rather than an immediate transformation. The bride usually arrived with a dowry assembled by her family, sometimes prepared over many years. This property accompanied her into her new household and formed part of her economic security. Legal documents often record the delivery of the dowry and note that the woman was formally transferred into the household of her husband's family. These documents sometimes also included provisions describing the financial consequences of divorce, showing how closely marriage was tied to property rights and economic stability. Even after the bride entered her new household, the marriage was not always completed at once. Evidence suggests that a period might pass before the union was fully realized. The agreement itself did not always bind the woman to a specific individual, but rather to a family group, reflecting the importance of descent through the male line. She became part of a lineage rather than simply the partner of a single man. When the bride remained in her parental home, the groom visited her household according to established custom. These visits marked the gradual completion of the marriage process and were accompanied by ceremonies and gatherings. The groom often arrived with male companions, and the celebrations could continue for some time. Material culture and literary imagery reveal that the marriage bed itself held symbolic importance. It appears frequently in dowry lists and ritual references, representing the moment when the union was physically confirmed and the continuation of the family line made possible. Legal records focus heavily on property, yet they also reveal social concerns surrounding marriage. The sexual integrity of the bride was treated as a serious matter, not primarily for moral reasons, but because families sought certainty about descent. Ensuring legitimate offspring meant preserving the continuity of the male line and protecting inheritance rights. Courts could hear disputes over such matters and call witnesses when necessary. At the same time, the bride was not considered a shared possession of the entire household. Strict taboos prohibited relations between a woman and members of her husband's family outside the marriage bond, and severe penalties existed for violations of these boundaries. Despite the central importance of marriage, the relationship was not always permanent. Divorce was possible, though the law treated the two partners very differently. A woman who rejected her husband faced extremely harsh penalties, while a man who repudiated his wife usually owed financial compensation. Marriage contracts sometimes specified the consequences of separation in advance, defining payments or punishments according to the circumstances. These provisions reflect a society in which marriage was a binding social and economic arrangement, rather than a purely personal choice. Even so, divorce does not appear to have been taken lightly. Social opinion could condemn a husband who dismissed his wife without good cause. The most common reasons for separation were accusations of misconduct, or the failure to produce children. The expectation that a marriage would produce sons remained fundamental, since sons ensured the continuation of the family line and performed duties toward deceased ancestors. Childlessness, however, did not always lead to divorce. Alternative solutions existed. A wife might provide a servant woman who would bear children on her behalf, and those children would be legally recognized as belonging to the household. This practice preserved family continuity, while maintaining the wife's position within the marriage. Similar arrangements existed for certain religious women who entered marriage without the expectation of ordinary conjugal life, showing that lineage could be secured through socially accepted substitutes. Women who did not remain within the structure of a patriarchal household occupied a more uncertain position. Widows and orphans were regarded as vulnerable members of society and often depended on protection from authorities or charitable action. A woman who left her husband's household might return to her family or seek an independent life elsewhere. Some women were associated with taverns and public spaces within the city, while others served in temples. The lives of these individuals remain difficult to reconstruct, as surviving documents rarely describe their experiences in detail. Most marriages appear to have been monogamous. A man generally had only one officially recognized wife. Exceptions occurred in special circumstances, such as illness or infertility, when additional partners might be permitted. Servant women could also form relationships with the household head, sometimes bearing children who might or might not share in inheritance. These arrangements reveal a system that valued stability in the official marriage while allowing limited flexibility in practice. Slavery formed another dimension of household life. Both male and female slaves could live within the home and formed part of its working population. They appear in inheritance records alongside other forms of property and could be bought or sold. Some were born into slavery, while others arrived through trade or warfare. Despite their status, slaves were not always heavily restrained in daily life, though measures existed to prevent escape. Marks identifying them as slaves could be imposed and later removed if they were granted freedom. The freeing of a slave was a formal act recognized by law. It involved a public declaration and the removal of identifying marks, symbolizing a transition from dependency to freedom. Children of freed individuals were usually born free, and legal texts discuss the complex status of children born from unions between free persons and slaves. Alongside permanent slavery existed temporary forms of servitude tied to debt, though the personal lives of those affected remain largely hidden in the sources. Temples in ancient Mesopotamia were not only religious centers, but also complex institutions with their own personnel, property, and social roles. Yet one important question remains difficult to answer. How many people actually lived within temple compounds? Early evidence suggests that some temples once controlled large groups of permanent workers, many of whom functioned almost like dependent laborers. Over time, however, this system appears to have changed. By later periods, temple personnel were fewer, and large resident populations no longer seem to have been typical. Archaeology provides only limited help in solving this question. The physical boundaries between sacred buildings and ordinary housing are often unclear. In many ancient cities, it is difficult to determine where temple space ended and everyday residential areas began. Even where temple complexes were clearly enclosed, space was usually too limited to house large communities. At most, a senior priest and his household might have lived within the inner enclosure. Clear evidence of temple residence is rare, with one important exception: communities of priestesses. One of the most impressive examples of such an institution was discovered at the city of Ur. Near the great sanctuary of the moon, God stood a monumental complex that combined sacred space with a residential area. Within its walls were living quarters, storage rooms, ceremonial halls, and even burial spaces. This establishment served as the residence of a high priestess devoted to the moon god and his divine consort. The building functioned as both a religious center and a private household, demonstrating how closely sacred and domestic life could be connected. The women who held this position were often members of royal families. One of the earliest and most celebrated was a daughter of a powerful king, remembered not only for her religious role, but also for her literary works. Over centuries, many rulers appointed their daughters or close relatives to similar positions, strengthening political ties between royal authority and temple institutions. Even much later, rulers continued this tradition as a way of connecting themselves to the past and reinforcing their legitimacy. Records from these temple households reveal that priestesses remained within the sacred enclosure throughout their lives and were buried there after death. Their presence did not end with burial. Ritual offerings and commemorations continued to honor them, much as families cared for their ancestors within ordinary homes. The temple thus preserved a continuous community that extended beyond death, linking generations of religious figures within the same sacred space. These women also served a political function. By dedicating royal daughters to temple service, ruling families placed trusted representatives within powerful religious institutions. Their role included offering prayers on behalf of their relatives and acting as intermediaries between the divine world and the ruling house. The exact details of their religious duties remain uncertain, but temple architecture suggests that sacred rituals, symbolizing divine union, formed part of their responsibilities. Their strict separation from ordinary society reflected the belief that they belonged exclusively to the deity they served. Not all priestess communities followed the same model. In some cities, large groups of religious women lived together within enclosed districts attached to major temples. These communities functioned almost like separate quarters within the city, complete with houses, streets, and shared facilities. Some of their members were of noble birth, while others came from prominent families seeking religious prestige or social advantage. Women who joined such communities were often described as belonging to the household of a god. Their lives were defined by ritual purity and separation from ordinary marriage. In some cases, they remained celibate, while in others they entered symbolic marriages that carried social and economic implications, rather than personal relationships. Even so, these women were not completely isolated. They maintained contact with their families, managed property, and participated in economic activities. Family strategy played an important role in the decision to dedicate daughters to temple service. By placing a daughter in a religious institution, a family could control the distribution of property and prevent wealth from passing to another lineage through marriage. At the same time, these positions offered prestige and sometimes created diplomatic connections between different regions. The existence of several generations of priestesses within certain families suggests that this practice became an established social strategy. Beyond their religious personnel, temples also served the wider population. They were places where individuals sought divine assistance, offered gifts, and performed rituals. Each temple was associated with particular gods who were believed to influence specific aspects of life. from agriculture to justice. Ordinary people approach these deities through prayers and offerings, often seeking help with personal concerns. Because individuals could not remain permanently within the temple, substitutes were sometimes created to represent them before the gods. Statues of worshippers were placed in sanctuaries so that their prayers might be continually presented. These figures symbolized a lasting presence within the sacred space and reflected the belief that divine attention could be maintained through ritual representation. Temples also played a central role in communication with the divine through various forms of divination. Specialists interpreted signs believed to reveal the will of the gods. These signs might appear in natural phenomena, dreams, or ritual examinations of sacrificed animals. The practice of examining the organs of animals, especially the liver, became a highly developed system of interpretation. Although modern observers may view such practices skeptically, they were treated with great seriousness in ancient society. Major political decisions, military campaigns, and personal choices alike were often guided by these rituals. In addition to spiritual services, temples accumulated considerable wealth. Gifts offered by individuals and rulers became permanent property of the sanctuary. These donations ranged from valuable objects and livestock to land and even human dependence. Some gifts were acts of gratitude, offered in thanks for divine favor or protection. Others were intended to secure future blessings. Temples also served practical economic functions. Their resources enabled them to act as financial institutions, providing loans and supporting commercial ventures. Their secure and sacred status made them ideal places for storing wealth. At times, they even performed charitable roles, assisting individuals in distress or supporting those without family protection. Through these activities, temples became deeply embedded in the social and economic life of the community. Alongside temples, another major institution shaped Mesopotamian society: the palace. While temples represented communal religious identity, palaces embodied political authority. The emergence of palaces reflected the development of centralized leadership distinct from purely religious administration. In some early cities, rulers governed from temple complexes, but over time, separate royal residences appeared, symbolizing independent secular power. These royal buildings were often constructed away from traditional sacred centers. Unlike temples, whose locations remained fixed by tradition, palaces could be relocated according to the needs and ambitions of new rulers. Their architecture emphasized security, authority, and administrative control. High walls, monumental entrances, and carefully planned spaces expressed the power of the state. A palace functioned as more than a royal residence. It served as a center of government, a storage facility for wealth, a workshop for crafts, and a stage for ceremonial display. Within its walls were living quarters for the royal family, administrative offices, storerooms, and areas for public audiences. As states grew more complex, these functions became increasingly specialized. One of the most important spaces within the palace was the audience hall. Here the ruler received visitors, officials, and foreign envoys. The design and decoration of these rooms emphasized authority and prestige. Walls were often adorned with images celebrating military victories, divine favor, or royal achievements. Such visual displays communicated political messages to all who entered. Court ceremonies reinforced the ruler's status. Visitors typically presented gifts when seeking an audience, reflecting a broader system of reciprocity that governed social and diplomatic relationships. Foreign envoys brought rare and valuable objects, while hosts responded with hospitality and generosity. These exchanges formed an essential part of political negotiation. The palace was also the centre of a vast household. The royal family, including wives, children and relatives, played significant roles in governance. Family members could hold administrative or religious positions, strengthening the authority of the ruling dynasty. Marriages between royal families served diplomatic purposes, creating alliances between states. Daily life within the palace required extensive organization. Servants, craftsmen, and officials managed food supplies, production, and administration. Records describe elaborate meals, complex preparations, and the distribution of provisions to visitors and messengers. The palace operated as a major economic institution, controlling estates, workshops, and trade activities. Rulers also carried important public responsibilities. They acted as judges, military leaders, and participants in major religious ceremonies. Although many administrative tasks could be delegated, certain symbolic duties required the king's personal presence. Public rituals confirmed the legitimacy of the ruler and reinforced the stability of the state. As kingdoms expanded, administrative systems grew more complex. Conquered regions were organized into provinces governed by appointed officials. These governors managed local administration while remaining loyal to the central authority. Members of the royal family were often placed in positions of power to secure control over distant territories. Through temples and palaces, ancient Mesopotamian society developed institutions that combined religious belief, political authority, and economic power. Temples expressed communal identity and spiritual devotion, while palaces embodied leadership and state organization. Together, they formed the foundations of a civilization in which sacred and secular authority were closely intertwined, shaping the lives of individuals and the structure of society itself.